According to reports, the Tigers are the front runner for a big-time wide receiver out of the state of Alabama. Well, I think this versatile player could be a heck of a get for Missouri. I'll tell you why coming up right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso, and a man who could not do 21 reps of 225 pounds, no matter how ideal the setup was at the NFL Combine. But you know what? I do want to talk about Darius Robinson's complaint about the bench setup at the Combine, and what is the deal anyway with why is it so counterintuitive that Missouri, for example, has a much nicer weight room than the two-time defending Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs? I'll tell you all about that here in just a little bit. First, a quick reminder, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. New customers, join today and you'll get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. And of course, I'm going to get started talking today about four-star wide receiver Dillon Alfred from Saraland, Alabama, because according to Adam Gorney over at Rivals.com, Missouri is the front runner currently for that young man's services. So what type of a player is Missouri potentially getting here in Dillon Alfred? Well, it's 6 feet tall, listed 178 pounds. I was somewhat going into watching his film expecting to see primarily a slot receiver, but what we saw was a much more versatile player. You'll see it too if you turn on his huddle tape over on the old Google machine there. A guy who can play inside in the slot for sure, but also a guy who played plenty on the outside as well. He can high point the football, run all types of different routes, too, for a high school player. And, by the way, seemed to all run them pretty well, too, lining up on the left side of the field, the right side of the field. Looks like a good yards after the catch guy. And, again, as is always the case anytime you're looking at high school football, remind yourself, yes, it is high school football. But I will say this, Saraland, Alabama, that is 6A Alabama high school football. That's about as good as it gets. Yes, there's 7A in Alabama too, so technically you're just the second highest level there, but that's really good stuff. Anytime in the deep south there, you're in the big time upper divisions. That's about as good of a comparison as you're going to get. Sometimes we've seen in the past, hey, the most famous example I always think of anyway, Dorial Green Beckham, just a tough guy. You know, his talent was obvious. The only thing you would question is, gosh, the level of talent he's playing against in high school, maybe not the best. Obviously, that was not what derailed Dorial Green Beckham's career. But regardless, I think obviously Dillon Alfred would be an excellent get for the Tigers. And if Missouri is currently the front runner, maybe one thing that could take them out of the contention for him, or out of that front runner position at the very least, is an offer from Alabama, which is not materialized yet. And I'm not sure that it will at this point in the process. The young man's made multiple visits to Auburn at this point, made a visit to Ole Miss as well. So if at this point that hasn't come, I'm just not sure if that's going to knock Missouri off of their perch. Obviously, if the Crimson Tide had gotten involved a little earlier, I could have seen that maybe affecting Missouri potentially in the future. But right now, seems like Missouri, Auburn, Alabama, and Arkansas, those would be your biggest competitors. But again, according to Adam Gorney over at Rivals.com, Missouri currently in the lead for a really interesting four-star wide receiver from the state of Alabama. Now, fortunately for this 2024 season, for Brian Early, the new edge position, the new defensive end / edge rusher position coach for Missouri, Well, he's replacing a really important guy, Kevin Peoples, who followed Blake Baker over to LSU. Well, again, fortunately for Brian Early, the position coaches don't take nearly as much heat. So it's going to be new Missouri defensive coordinator Corey Batoon, who's going to take the heat and get the credit as well. That's the other side of the thing, and a little bit more money. I think that's probably the best of all, isn't it? But you know what? Really the new star of the Missouri defense, no, it's not Corey Batoon, and I mean star as in the position star. For all intents and purposes, the star position, really just a fancy name for a strong safety, right? Well, Coach Early similarly has a fancy name for an edge rusher, basically, on his team. It's called the Joker position, and Early said that Johnny Walker, who was the Cotton Bowl MVP on the defensive side of the ball, along with a couple transfers, Zion Young from Michigan State and also Darius Smith from Georgia, all fit into the Joker role that the team wants to use a bit more this season. So the Joker basically is going to be an outside linebacker who can rush the passer, but also does have some coverage responsibilities that they can handle in space as well. Quote, for us, that's the premier pass rusher in this defense. You're looking for a longer, leaner, like a basketball player is the prototype that you're looking for at that position over there into the boundary. You're also looking for a bigger anchor type into the field. In other words, the other side of the ball here, folks. So Johnny, Joe, in other words, Joe Moore, and Darius Smith are playing that Joker position for us into the boundary, and I think there's some good, healthy competition there. Now, here's the thing. This is probably a good time to remind all of you a good, what do I call it? I'm blanking on my own stupid name for my segment at this point. Ah, yes, Gridiron Glossary. There we go. It came to me finally there, deep in the recesses of the brain matter. But the Joker, usually if it's going to be on the boundary side, well, that means essentially to the shorter side of the field. Of course, every snap, the ball's going to be either closer to one hash mark or the other. So the short side of the field, that's called the boundary. While the longer side of the field with more real estate to cover, well, that's the field side. So in other words, usually, unless the offense's passing strength is to that shorter side of the field, well, that's where that Joker player is going to be. Less room for that player less geography for them to have to cover, basically, less space, but they'll be the best pass rusher, that type of deal. On the other hand, a little bit of coverage there, a little bit of coverage responsibilities, probably checking a tight end and also maybe the running back out of the backfield occasionally. So not a huge bit of news there, but it does seem like Missouri, it will allow a little bit more versatility in terms of who they can put in that position. Doesn't have to be a straight defensive lineman with his hand in the ground. It can be a guy who can stand up and play linebacker as well. And speaking of Missouri edge rushers, well, former Missouri Tiger Darius Robinson, after his bench reps at the Combine, took to his X feed and said, quote, "This is not an accurate reflection of my bench press. The setup at the Combine is unacceptable. The rack and bar is uneven with the J-hooks, and the bench moves with the carpet floor. I will be doing this again at my pro day on March 22nd. Well, that did spark something there. That is pretty bizarre that the NFL has a less than ideal setup. If the 225 reps, if that's really an important thing, yeah, let's maybe, I don't know, bolt the thing to the floor or something like that. Just a thought. But anyway, I do think it's interesting. This did trigger another thought, which is that the Kansas City Chiefs recently have gotten a little bit of crap online and also just the NFL in general for some of the amenities for the players not being up to snuff, at least according to the players themselves. And there were some pictures of the Chiefs weight room circulating over social media the last week or so. And you got to admit, especially if you compare the Chiefs weight room to the Missouri weight room in the new South End Zone complex that was built a few years ago, There's no comparison. The Missouri weight room, it's much glitzier and fancier and everything. So that's a little bit counterintuitive, right? Missouri has a better weight room than the two-time defending Super Bowl champs. Well, there's a good reason for that. And actually, I think that type of setup, I think the days of this are coming to an end. So I want to explain why coming up here in just a little bit. But first, let me tell you about eBay Motors, because passion, drive, and patience, what brings home the winning trophy, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With more than 122 million parts, for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber and not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. So it's quite possible that the National Football League and the Kansas City Chiefs need to step their game up, include in terms of amenities for the players. I'm not going to ignore that, deny that, or even get into that right now, because this is a college football show. And the reason college football, their facilities are so ridiculous is because previously you couldn't spend money on the players. So how do you attract people without spending money on their salaries? Well, you give them side benefits. That's actually, hey, quick economics lesson. That's exactly why back in the day when there were price controls during the Great Depression, well, people got around those type of salary controls and stuff like that by offering free healthcare benefits and stuff like that. Well, you see a similar concept, especially a few years ago, back before name, image, and likeness and all this stuff. Well, what would you do to attract players? You have the best facilities you can possibly get. So I have wondered, all the way back in 2019, now the project was going on during the 2018 season when the South End Zone was built. I have to wonder if this was 2024 when Missouri was making this decision, would you make that same decision again? I'm sure they would still make some type of upgrades back there for sure. And I happen to sit in the South End Zone in the bleacher part anyway, and I enjoy it over there. Hey, the bathrooms are nicer. That's for darn sure. No troughs, a big plus in this podcaster's book. But again, maybe just not as crazy and glitzy and over the top as really that weight room is for Missouri. So again, maybe the Chiefs do need to step their game up. But at the same time, I think the days of Missouri and other similar programs piling a bunch of money into facilities instead of the players themselves, well, it seems pretty obvious that those days are over. And there've been actually articles written about donor fatigue and Ole Miss athletic director. And I mention Ole Miss because obviously along with Missouri, I think Ole Miss has been one of the big beneficiaries really so far of the NIL laws. But here's the thing, while their donors and their fans are stepping up and spending money on NIL in a big way, well, obviously, especially in an inflationary environment, money starts to run out eventually. You can't just spend all your disposable money on Ole Miss or Missouri football at this point. So to that point, Ole Miss athletic director Keith Carter said in the past week that program has put on the shelf plans to renovate the stadium, basically citing exactly what I said, the current landscape. It just doesn't make nearly as much sense anymore to have a fancy new football stadium or renovations to that instead of just flat out taking the money and put it in your guys' pockets, quite literally. Now, okay, literally, yeah, they're going through intermediaries here, blah, 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 blah. So we can quibble with literally, but for all intents and purposes, and yes, maybe I do say that phrase too much, but seriously, how does it make any sense to build some fancy weight room versus actually giving the money to your players? So again, as long as the Kansas City Chiefs, as long as they can still work out, get everything they need done, they don't need a waterfall in the entrance, is my point. As long as everything is safe. Hey, Darius Robinson's probably got a point. The benches need to be actually, bolted down, that type of thing. But as long as there's adequate equipment, as long as there's air conditioning, come on. Wouldn't you guys rather actually have the money in your pockets versus put in to the team? I think maybe some of the players have lost the script a little bit in the NFL. But the main point is, in college, I think the days of all these fancy facilities, none of that made any sense a few years ago in terms of actual, hey, what are we doing here? Why don't we actually give this to the guys who make this all possible instead of just trying to, attract them with the shiniest object that you possibly can? Again, I just think those days have got to be logically over. And Ole Miss's Keith Carter there saying that they're putting their stadium renovations, quote, on the shelf. That's a pretty strong indication of where we are. And I will say this about Missouri's spring football coverage so far. First of all, appreciate everybody who does go out there and actually covers practices, because Lord knows I do not have time in my life to do that at this very moment. Maybe someday, but right now I just don't have time to get out there for spring football practice. But the amount of actual time that the reporters get to observe practice is so limited now that you're just not getting as much hype as I think you could. So I'm going to suggest something. I think there is a happy medium here that maybe even the Missouri Athletic Department will find agreeable. Here's the thing. Back in the day, Missouri fans like myself, when in the Gary Pinkel era, especially pre-SEC, when you basically had more or less, at least compared to today, unfettered access to practice and able to do your observations and all that stuff, as long as you just didn't, there were certain things that were off limits. Hey, if we're running this trick play today here on special teams, well, go ahead and don't give out the details of said play, for instance. Well, back in the day of much more access, Dave Matter would just have these great practice notebooks, and the amount of value in terms of predictive value that those observations from practice had, I don't really know. All I know is, as a Mizzou fan, as a Mizzou football fan who's dying for any little tidbits of information, I ate it all up. And here's the thing, Missouri, you have Dave Matter on your payroll right now. So let's bring back Dave Matter's practice notebooks. Why the heck not? Because here's the thing, again, as a fan, I can live, in this particular case, I can live with the athletic department controlling the narrative as long as it feeds my sick and addictive desire for practice observations. In all seriousness, again, what's wrong with that? If Dave is just mostly positive and telling me the good stuff that has happened, hey, Marvin Burks had a heck of a hit and interception at free safety. Just stuff like that. Just give it to me. I promise you there's a market for that. And again, just because it would be propaganda, more or less, well, that doesn't mean it can't be entertaining. Heck, the Missouri mini movies that everybody liked from this past season, well, that was basically propaganda, folks. I got news for you. That was very carefully controlled and edited by the Missouri Athletic Department. But it was entertaining, though, wasn't it? And it did give you a little bit of an inside look of what was happening, at least the look that they wanted you to have. And on yesterday's program, I started off by saying that Dennis Gates needs a defensive coordinator. Well, I had one listener say that he thinks he needs an offensive coordinator as well. I just got to disagree with that, and I'm going to explain why coming up here in pretty good detail in just a little bit. But first, let me tell you about FanDuel. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. And believe it or not, I have a hot UEFA Champions League take. As much as I'm a big Erling Haaland guy, I just don't think this is the year for Manchester City, especially plus 160. Listen, I don't have a winner for you. I just think after winning all three last year, the league, the FA Cup, the Champions League, just seems like it's going to be too much for Man City to repeat this year. But regardless, you might not even give a crap about soccer. But regardless, you got to visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. It's FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. So obviously, if you're an everydayer, you're well aware of my qualms with Dennis Gates and, well, his defensive principles, especially this season. I really feel like Missouri needs a defensive coordinator. I'll say that in quotes, not a literal defensive coordinator, but just a different set of ideas and principles next season. My primary example is just always, how many times is Missouri going to help off of the strong side corner three off of dribble penetration, just leaving one of the easiest passes and shots in all of basketball wide open. I just can't, frankly, take that anymore, and just over helping, over double teaming, and all that good stuff. Well, viewer over on YouTube, Craig, said he needs an offensive coordinator too. This 4 guys standing around watching one guy dribble, then chuck one up isn't working. No one is really looking to set up teammates, and on he goes here a little bit into some other thoughts as well. But I just got to disagree with Craig, and also my father-in-law had a similar take yesterday when I was talking to him as well. And I would just first say to Craig and to anybody else who has a similar thought, did you like the offense last season? Because I sure as heck did. That was a top 10 offense. In fact, the second best Missouri offense statistically in the post-Norm Stewart era. That's just a fact in terms of actual stats. And by the way, it looked pretty too. There was no just 4 guys watching one guy dribble last year. No, the ball movement was tremendous. And to this idea of guys just standing around, well, I would just say you got to watch the whole court and not just the ball, because if you watch the guy who is the reason he's dribbling a lot is because the action that's happening off the ball this season, it's not working as well, because quite simply, Missouri doesn't have the shooting that it had last season. It doesn't have the playmaking that it had last season. And when you don't have that, guess what happens, especially when you play a lot of guys around the perimeter like Missouri does under Dennis Gates? Well, the floor shrinks tremendously, and your advantages that you have from spacing everybody out, well, it kind of goes away. So to me, maybe a somewhat fair question would be, does Dennis Gates' offense work if he doesn't have good three-point shooting? Well, that's a fair question, but I would then follow that up, does any offense in 2024 college basketball work without good three-point shooting? Because, again, without it, boy, it just seems like these days defenses are so much not only more athletic and long, but they're also smarter than they used to be too. Speaking of the Norm Stewart era, back then, all you heard about defensively was that defense is about effort, which to some point is true, but also what you heard about in the Norm Stewart era, he would allow guys to pick who they were going to guard before the game, essentially. They would just I'm going to match up with this guy. That's not exactly a lot of defensive scouting. It's not exactly a lot of rotating and all this different stuff. There's just been huge advancements in defense over the years. And to that point, again, I'm just not sure that you can really have a really efficient offense in college basketball if you don't have good shooting, not only just for the shots, of course, themselves that go in, but for the spacing that it provides. The bottom line is, regardless if Craig or my father-in-law or anybody else, if I convince them in that previous argument or not, I think we can definitely agree that Missouri has a talent deficit compared to last season. So let's do a hypothetical here. What if you put Kobe Brown and D'Moy Hodge? Let's say, I know Hodge was out of eligibility. Technically, Kobe Brown could have come back this season. Obviously, he made the right choice to go to the NBA. This is just a hypothetical here, a thought experiment. What if both of those guys were still here? What would this team look like? Well, it'd be a lot better. We can agree on that. But why would it be better? It'd be better because suddenly your offense would work. You've got, again, two shooters, two playmakers, especially Brown at his size, such a versatile playmaker off the dribble that he was, a guy who could take advantage of mismatches. Suddenly your offense looks tremendously better. But defensively, I don't know that much has changed. I really don't. I think it's slightly better. Certainly D'Moy Hodge was good at causing havoc, which is all Missouri really had defensively last season was havoc. Because if they weren't creating havoc, well, a lot of times they were creating a lot of wide open shots. It's one reason why Missouri, after winning in the first round, unfortunately got bounced by 15th seeded Princeton in the next round. The Tigers just got out-executed. Our defense was just not good enough, quite simply. And unfortunately, it looks right now like that was a bit of a harbinger for this season. So, you know what, Craig, Clifford, everybody else, I appreciate your thoughts, but I'm sticking to my guns for now. A smart guy is willing to change his mind in the future. I think after this type of season, I'm willing to question just about everything with Missouri basketball. But again, after last year, I think there's plenty of reasons to believe that Dennis Gates knows what he's doing offensively. But so far, if you think he knows what he's doing defensively, that's just all based on blind faith. And if you have that blind faith, heck, I hope it pays off, and I hope you're right. But hey, anyway, as always, thanks for joining me here on Locked On Mizzou. Thanks for making this show your first listen every day, and thanks for telling another true son or daughter about the show. Send them to LockedOnMizzou.com to find your links to, of course, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, the whole deal. But again, LockedOnMizzou.com, the easiest place to send a new listener. So until next time, I am John Miller, and thanks for listening to Locked on Mizzou.